Hello, Lisa Davis. Hi.
Hi.
I'm really pleased that you could join us today to talk to us about your work. I'm Joanna Bourke. I'm Professor of History at Birkbeck College, University of London. But more important in terms of this interview, I'm also the PI for the SHAME project, which SHAME stands for Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters, which is a Wellcome Trust funded 5-year interdisciplinary project that looks at sexual violence, medicine and psychiatry. But today we're really thrilled that you can come and speak to us briefly about an organization that you founded in 2013 called Changing Relations. And of course, you are managing director of that company. Lisa, can you just tell us about what is Changing Relations? What do you do?
So we deliver education and training to schools, businesses and organisations, and we use the arts as the tool to transform the way people think about gender stereotypes and relationship behaviours. So what that means in practice is that we take an artistic product, which we have usually created in quite a participatory way, where we have gathered the real perspectives of real people affected by the issues that we're looking at. And that artistic product is the engagement stimulus, let's say, that we place at the centre of a learning intervention, whether that's in the context of training in the workplace or in the context of schools. So, for example, we have a piece of work around domestic abuse. We have a film, we also have a soundscape. They each take a slightly different look on the subject matter, and we use that to initially to move people emotionally as that starting point to start thinking about what it must be like for others, and therefore how they could possibly respond more constructively.
Okay, and I mean, this is a big creative way of looking at what is a really big problem in our society, in fact globally. Yeah. How did you get into the field?
Okay, so it actually started with the 1 Billion Rising movement, and there was an incident that actually happened in India, but which received huge kind of worldwide coverage, which was the brutal gang rape and murder of Jyoti Singh. And somehow this particular incident it really struck a nerve with me, because I suppose what it epitomized is the far end of the concept that to some degree women are hated, which it does sound quite extreme to say those words, but at the same time such an action is quite extreme, and you think, well, how is this happening? And I'm a woman, and wow, I just felt deeply offended, I guess, that kind of thing would be meted out to women just because they're women. And this really galvanized me to action, and I got involved locally in Durham, where we're based, in the 1 Billion Rising campaign that was happening in our area. And I suppose what I noticed in that period of time of getting involved in activism was that there is a real risk of only preaching to the choir, and not necessarily reaching other people. I mean, we're kind of in an interesting period of time to talk about that, with the Black Lives Matters protests happening around the world. And I don't want to say in any way that activism isn't a constructive approach, because it absolutely can be. However, what I felt was that there was a value in trying to create some tools that didn't feel like telling people what they should think differently, but would reach people in a different way. And the magical thing about the arts really is that it reaches you kind of here with this emotional response that you have to content, but it also reaches the mind in a different way, in that it prompts a kind of a curiosity response, which is different to somebody listening to a lecture or being told something. It makes you think, oh, I hadn't thought about that before. And so for me, I feel that that's quite a useful way in to encouraging people to think about things that perhaps they might not want to think about, they might avoid. I think domestic abuse, for all we've given it quite a lot of media coverage over recent years. A lot of our soaps have covered it as a topic, which is great. But I think there's still an element of people feeling, a bit uncomfortable to talk about it, in their own actual lives. If they might notice something awry with somebody that they know, you know, there can be a little bit of a blinkered tendency that goes on that then means that it remains hidden away and not addressed. So that really, for me, was the motivation for getting into the subject matter, but then also the motivation for taking the particular approach of using the arts.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because, you know, I mean, I think a lot of people listening to you and listening to other people who are actually actively involved in these kinds of movements think, oh, you know, it seems a little bit too much to get involved, and you know, what can I do to help this problem? You know, I'm just one person, and you know, I'm you know, not a mega star or whatever. What can I do? And what would you say to people listening who are thinking, I'd love to get involved, but I just, you know, I don't think I'm good enough. I don't know where to start.
To get involved in the movement to make change, do you mean?
Yes, yes, exactly. To become an activist like you are.
So I think, to be honest, you can really break it down to small actions that do make a difference. And with everything that we do, we are always really keen to encourage that thinking of, okay, if this, then what? What can I do? And to be honest, the first step is actually around noticing. And I think the Black Lives Matters campaigners have also been making this point, you know, for example, with white privilege, you know, notice it. And if you notice it, then that might already start to prompt you to think a little bit differently. And, you know, I think for sanity sometimes, or for an easy life, we often kind of just go around, we do our daily things, we think, we limit how much we think about, and sometimes we have to do that to cope with all the things that we're juggling. But sometimes then, if we can bring a few additional things into our consciousness. So for example, we had a recent exhibition around County Durham in 2019 that was on the theme of gender norms and stereotypes. And one of the comments that we received from somebody was, oh gosh, I hadn't thought of it like that. I must be nicer to my husband. Which was quite, in a way, that's a funny response, but it's also that's really important, because, you know, we think about gender, and we often think about that from the point of view of women, and the way in which gender norms have a negative effect on women, their equality of opportunity, for example, barriers that might be in place. But gender norms and stereotypes also have a really negative effect on men. If we think about the adult suicide rate, it is higher. 75% of suicides committed by adults are men. And so then we have to ask why, what's going on there? Is that linked at all to the gender stereotypes around, you know, this idea that the man needs to be strong, needs to be in control? What does that do then if we are sort of pushing that message as a society? So the first step in terms of what can I do, if we can just be aware of that, you know, if we can just say, oh gosh, yeah, maybe that's true actually, and, you know, connect up some dots, it already starts us to think in a different way, and we might then say something different. So for example, let's say that a male partner or friend or family member comes up to us and says, you know, I'm really struggling. What if we say man up to that person? Oh, man up, go on, get a grip. If we've already started noticing and connecting dots, we might actually think twice before saying something like that. And similarly with domestic abuse, one of the things that drives us and many domestic abuse campaigners absolutely bananas is when people say, why don't you just leave? As if it's so simple. And they haven't stopped to think about, well, actually, what is the nature of domestic abuse? And what is the impact of that on the person who's experiencing it? And what does that mean in terms of the number of barriers that might be in place to being able to safely leave that kind of situation? So if we start to bring this stuff into our consciousness and notice, we might start, you know, that very simple step of actually coming out with some more constructive, more empathetic responses instead of unthinking responses that really don't help the other person in whichever situation they're in.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I've looked on the website of Changing Relations. It's really, really fascinating. I, really enjoyed looking at the diversity of things that you do. But also was very clear that this is very ambitious in many ways, and you must have faced many challenges along the way since 2013. What are some of the challenges you've faced, and how did you get around those problems?
I would say probably the biggest challenge realistically, and I'm sure that anybody who is in the kind of voluntary social enterprise sector or the arts sector would appreciate this, is finance. And when you're trying to grow an organization in the early stages, inevitably you as the person in charge of that end up having to do an awful lot of multitasking. And the problem with that is that there are different types of roles you might need to play in an organization that really require a very different headspace. So, for example, project managing the development of a new piece of work, whether it's a film, whether it's an exhibition tour, it's a very specific type of task that needs to be done. It's quite detail oriented. And that's really quite different to the type of strategic thinking that is needed in terms of looking at the landscape of what the opportunities for development might be, what might be the funding to enable this kind of work. And so to mix those types of tasks in a single day is quite difficult. And when you're very busy project managing, but you also actually need to be spending the time for the development of the organization to keep going, to bring that finance in. That is a challenge. It is a challenge. And I think that partly the way you overcome that is persistence. Persistence, I think, is pretty central, but linked to that, I would say, is reflection. So there have been times when we have submitted proposals to the Arts Council, for example, and they've come back with a negative response, but then we've looked at what the feedback is. We've felt this is important, this is good, but perhaps we just need to do some little tweaks. What is it that they are saying? How can we make those little tweaks to make it better? And then we have been successful. And so I think that combined element of persistence, but being persistent in a reflective way, where you're always trying to learn and to improve what it is that you put out there. I think that's pretty crucial.
Well, of course, we're getting to the inevitable topic. You're talking about persistence, and of course, we're in a global crisis, economic crisis, health crisis, COVID-19. These are very difficult times for everyone. Domestic violence, domestic abuse, rates are soaring. How has COVID-19, the lockdown, the global crisis affected the work that you do?
So, to be honest, it hasn't had an overly negative effect. And that, I think, is because we're already in a process of shifting towards thinking about how we can make as much of what we do as we can digital. And the reason for that is around the breadth of access to that content, and therefore a greater impact that can be achieved. One aspect that has been a little difficult was that we have a domestic abuse awareness training that we deliver to businesses, and we had a number of businesses before the lockdown with whom we were in consultation around coming in and delivering that training for them. And that training is based around being in a room, which obviously can't happen. So that has been something where we've had to go, right, okay, we have to create an e-learning version where we still use our artistic content, and we try to make it as interactive and engaging as is the approach that we would take if it were live. But I think with the type of work that we do, it's relatively simple to make a switch to making it digital. And so that's what we've done. We've looked at what can we make digital, what can we make freely available. So we've done a lockdown campaign that uses our soundscape content, Us Too, which is all about demystifying the diversity of people who can be affected by domestic abuse and also perpetrate domestic abuse, to take away some of those stereotypes of who is the likely victim or the likely perpetrator. That's a 30-minute soundscape that was in a museum last year, the Bowes Museum in Barnard Castle. And what my colleague has done is taken it down, broken it down into little kind of 30-second clips that we've then freely shared on social media, to try to get as wide a reach as we can with that thinking around, okay, here we are in lockdown, people who might already be experiencing domestic abuse, suddenly that situation has really intensified for them. And if we're sitting thinking, oh, well, it couldn't possibly be any of my neighbours, this is a lovely neighbourhood, those people are going to be suffering in silence. And so we felt it was a really important moment to take that content that anyway was digital because it's sound, and look at how can we share that and try to contribute to the situation that needs addressing.
Just one last thing, and it's coming back to something that you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, and that is about the importance of making people aware, drawing attention to, acknowledging one's own prejudices or one's own limitations. What would you say to people who, about how, in very practical terms, we can all sort of help raise awareness, help survivors or victims of domestic abuse?
I think that we need to be a bit less afraid, and we need to be ready to be a little bit uncomfortable. And again, referring to the Black Lives Matters protests that are happening around the world at the moment, I've seen people saying, don't worry that you might get it a little bit wrong, but please at least just try. And I think there is something of that. I think there are subject matters where we avoid them. We avoid them because we're a bit uncomfortable, we're not totally sure. So for example, let's say that we have somebody within our social network who we do sort of feel like, is everything okay for that person? But if we say absolutely nothing, it's really difficult being in an abusive relationship and you're sort of ground down. And so that person actually has less confidence to come forward and say, I really need some help. So to some extent, it's sort of on us as society members to say, are you okay? Is everything okay for you? And almost just to accept it. If you're not used to having that conversation, that kind of conversation, it might be a little bit uncomfortable for you at first, but actually if you just start, the other person is going to be so grateful to be noticed, and to have that opportunity to be listened to and heard, that we need to make that effort. I think that's the key.
Great. Okay, Lisa Davis, thanks, of Changing Relations. Thanks so much to talking to me today. It's been really, really enjoyable. Thanks a lot.
You're very welcome.